there are at least 3 class actions pending right now in the United States. One is against GitHub, Microsoft, and OpenAI. Another one is against Stability AI, Midjourney, and DeviantArt, and a third against, again, Stability AI, mostly having to do with, in these cases, several of them had to do in particular with using copyrighted visual works as training data. That's a very, very complicated area. I wonder if you could comment on that. In other words, both from perhaps a technical standpoint, what does it mean to use material like this for training data? And what your thoughts are on whether that might, in fact, be an infringement of the copyright owner's rights.
Yeah, I think, this is the place where these two lawsuits are the ones, the largest ones that are going to be a framework for what happens regarding AI. So I've been following it also with a lot of interest, and I think they're both those, the ones against the GitHub, Microsoft, OpenAI for coding, and the other ones for images against Midjourney, DeviantArt by Getty. They are kind of asking slightly different questions. One is more about the inputs, the other one's more about outputs. I think the coding is both of them deal with both input and outputs, but the focus is the GitHub Copilot focus is more on outputs. That generated output has phrases and elements of code that are similar to things in the input, which should not be allowed, or whether that was allowed within the GitHub rules that you sign away when you upload stuff to GitHub. So we'll see what happens there. But as you can see, that's about outputs and how similar are ideas in the outputs to examples in the input data sets, which is going to be crucial for any new generated media. If there is music and then there's a certain phrase which is exactly the same as something in the data set, then how does current copyright law deal with it? And I know it has always been case by case with the jury, and sometimes a tiny phrase of just 3 notes might be the core idea that has to be protected, like ta 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 ta. That's just 3 notes, but it's a very recognizable idea. And sometimes it's longer chord progressions that might still not might be copied, but those are the fundamental blocks of music, and therefore maybe they shouldn't. So I think that aspect of it is super important for music, as to what ideas in the output are similar to the inputs. And there might be it'll be interesting to see how they deal with it. Already I see that Copilot, which and GitHub, the platforms, they exist, they are running right now, so they haven't stopped their businesses. So the service exists and we can use it. And I already see that it starts citing resources. So it will cite that this particular code was taken from this particular code base. I think that's a great technological solution, where along with producing the idea, it also quotes or makes citations that here are the pieces of music which were closest and were used in coming up with this idea.
Oh, that's fascinating.
But it's not so obvious, because sometimes the idea that a 2-5 is followed by a 1 has happened in many, many pieces of music. And you can't really point to a certain music and say, this was the music that contributed to this idea. So we are definitely going to see a hierarchical breaking down of units of ideas, whether it's single words, single phrases. Similarly, in music, it would be notes, chord progressions, and somehow potentially citing the sources was going to be crucial. Everybody, I think the people that build the technology would also want to be able to provide that. Like, for example, Google, Meta, OpenAI, they're making these foundation models where I can say rock music and put a prompt and then press a button and get some music. That music has to make sure that it's not having phrases and elements that are just exactly picked up from something in the data set.
So there have to be safeguards, you mean?
Yeah, there have to be safeguards.
Well, so you I'm glad you differentiated between the GitHub case, which has,
Yes.
I guess, primarily to do with copying code, using code, whereas the other two cases have to do with using the actual
Images.
visual works as training data. So what about that? That's a different set of issues.
Absolutely. And that one deals more with input. Here we talked about more of the output. That is the output more similar to something in the data set. This one talks more about input, which is is it legal for a company to ingest art that is just out there? And do I have the rights at the input level where I can opt in, opt out, maybe even get credit for this foundation model training on my work? And this one's going to be interesting also on how it develops. We are already seeing that different countries are treating it differently. Japan put out a statement about allowing any kind of input, copyrightable or not, to train such models. And they said that they are going to focus on the outputs and see as the case by case if a certain output infringes on copyright. But they're not going to make restrictions on input. Europe and the US are, of course, dealing with right now, trying to make sure that inputs are also licensed the right way, which makes sense because places that own large data sets like Getty Images, they want some say in their model, their entire catalog being used.
Right.
And I think with music, that part is also crucial. And we're seeing it right now with the way
let's say the music publishers are the analogy, the analog of Getty Images, right?
Right.
All the music publishers hold vast amounts of copyrighted material. They don't want to see it used as inputs for training models necessarily.
Right. Well, right now they don't, I think, because they are obviously seeing it as a thing that they don't have control over, which makes sense because they do not have control over it right now. Different companies are building models with different intentions and priorities in mind. But I can imagine that each of these catalog owners will want to train their own models on those catalogs and release it in some form for people to use. So it seems to me that regardless of what the decision is being made, we are going to have foundation models trained on catalogs of music. Whether each catalog owner decides to do it in their own way and say that we're not going to share our foundation models with you, or if people decide to join forces together and make a giant foundation model, it's going to look similar. I think the first reaction has been to not allow training of foundation models, but I can definitely see the next steps would be for the catalog owners to figure it out as a revenue stream.
Well, that's really interesting. It's kind of like the label's first reaction to digital music was try to make it go away. And you know, through lawsuits and whatnot. But ultimately it became the savior of the recording industry when they finally embraced first downloads and then streaming. And that's what's now the recording business is back up to its old levels, or even beyond.
We had to create a licensing model when sampling started to exist, you know, with various, as it became popular in hip hop and all, you know, and built that whole catalog of music. They had to create a licensing model because the behavior wasn't going away.
That's right. That's
so
right.
Do you think that this will be, they'll have to license the material that they're training from?
Well, it definitely makes sense that catalog owners will figure out some revenue mechanism. If either they build it themselves and collect revenue every time their models are used, or they rent it out to Google and OpenAI, come up with a deal, there's going to be new revenue streams for catalog owners. I think they have the power and the legal teams to figure that out. So hopefully that's going to be the first things we see. Artists themselves as individuals do not have the legal teams and the powers to make ways that they get revenue, new revenue streams as well. So it's going to be interesting how it develops, but we can't wish it away because right now the catalog owners are trying to take the sounds off or like are threatening Spotify and Apple Music to not share their catalogs, which totally makes sense to me that they would do that. But open source, the world of open source that works in a decentralized fashion where people are just excited for these models, they will just stream it in different places. And if they don't have legal ways of doing it, it's just so easy now to just make copies digitally. I can screen record something, I can record an audio on my microphone. So I think it's a good idea for everyone to embrace these the new world we live in.